I want to frolic and go about like the light-footed goats, so said Heidi. I can't agree with Heidi more. I too want to go about like the light-footed goats. On this Swiss National Day, I take to running up and down my hill, Sophie's Hill. It's August 1st, my friends, and yes, we are celebrating, and I can't thank you enough for your votes. The red dirndl won over the blue dress. But I had to figure out what to do for a hat. So in my research of Swiss outfits that women wore throughout the centuries, I noticed a lot of straw hats. So I took my 18th century straw hat and I improvised to go with my dirndl. Topping off the outfit is, of course, the apron. Now, there's a way you need to tie the bow. On the left-hand side, it means you are single. On the right-hand side, it means you are married. I, by mistake, tied my bow on the left-hand side, so I need to apologize to my husband. Speaking of dirndls, they have seen a fashion resurgence over the years, with many more young women buying them to wear almost every day. Researchers say that this is just a yearning for a return of home, a return of the past. I am also getting ready to make my Swiss rolls for August 1st breakfast, and I cut a cross into the dough. Unfortunately, I didn't cut too deeply into the dough because the cross kind of got lost when the bread baked. So my friends, welcome to Old Stonewall Farm. Now a little Swiss National Day fun for your enjoyment.
I'm a yodeling miss from the land of the Swiss. I am the Bernese mountain dog. Hitch me to a cart, I'll pull with my heart. I love my people and I love my job. Back on the farm I was quick to learn, proud to be from the canton of Bern. Yodel-odel-ay, the hurdy-gurdy place for the Bernese mountain dog. I'm handsome in my coat of black, curly waves upon my back, with russet trim and snow-tipped paws. On my chest is the white Swiss cross. I'm a yodeling miss from the land of the Swiss. I'm the Bernese mountain dog. I'm a yodeling miss from the land of the Swiss. Yodeling miss from the land of the Swiss.
Yes, Fritz and I had a fun time doing that little montage. He absolutely adores that song. And I do want to eventually train him to pull a cart because Bernese mountain dogs, they were work dogs in the Alps. They would lug the big containers of milk into the villages. I still have to train Fritz to come when called and to get into the car before I could train him to pull a cart. So wish me luck and say a prayer. But this Swiss National Day, I did something that I haven't done in years, and I took down my copy of Heidi from the bookshelf. I find the whole book rooted in the letter that Paul writes to the Romans, in which he says that all things work together for good for those who believe and trust in God. Heidi's story is all about one challenge after another, and seeing that when life doesn't work out as planned, that God will indeed, though, make something good out of it, that God is still answering prayers. Heidi is, of course, an orphan, and her uppity aunt doesn't want her anymore because she doesn't want to take care of this child, and the aunt is just very into material goods. So she takes Heidi to live with her curmudgeon old grandfather up in the Alps. And as the story unfolds, Heidi just endears herself to everybody who meets her. This little girl, all throughout it, finds a way to impact their lives so that all things do work together for good. Eventually, Heidi has to leave her beloved home in the Alps because the aunt comes back and wants Heidi to start working to earn money, and she has to take care of this invalid named Clara. And so Heidi is taken away from her beloved Alps to live in the city to take care of this girl. And Heidi is very homesick. She misses the Alps a lot. So all throughout this story, it is woven with this trust God no matter what. And so a few things that I learned from Heidi this time around as I read it. Well, number one, be happy with the simple things in life. Embrace simplicity. The scene in the book where she has this beautiful hat with feathers next to her straw hat, and she prefers the straw hat because the beautiful hat with the feathers, it was a reminder of her aunt who was just into material gain and selfishness and wealth. And Heidi didn't want that. Rather, she treasured her old straw hat as a reminder of what gave her joy, who she was. She was a girl who belonged in the mountains. Another thing I learned from Heidi is this: never take for granted the concept of home. Heidi's home is in the Alps, and when she's not there, she begins to get depressed. And eventually, at the end of the book, she returns to the Alps, and she is just filled with joy once again. She gets to see her grandfather, Peter, who takes care of the goats. And speaking of the goats, she gets to see Snowflake and Little Swan and Little Bear, some of the goats in the story. That is where her heart comes to life. That is where she knows she belongs. I love living in houses that were built in the 18th century. And at one time in my life, I questioned, is that right? I mean, as a pastor, you're to go where God leads you. But I always had a caveat. God, lead me to a place only if there's an 18th century house that I could live in. And one year I was seeing a spiritual director, and I was talking to her about this, and I was struggling with it. I'm like, is this really right of me as a pastor to give God this caveat? Please, I want to live in an 18th century home. And the spiritual director said to me, maybe it's not wrong. Maybe your affinity to old houses is the very thing that God put in you. If it brings you joy, if that's where you feel at home, then God can use that. And maybe God is using that. So there's a part of the book where Heidi sees this field of wildflowers, and she just picks them all and she puts them in her apron. By the time she gets home to grandfather, she takes the flowers out and they're all wilted. And she's sad about that. But the grandfather said to Heidi, these wildflowers, they're not meant to be picked. They're meant to live on the mountain. They're meant to give the mountain beauty. I always loved what grandfather said to Heidi, but I never made the connection that those wildflowers perhaps were symbolism of Heidi. So like that wildflower picked from the mountains, Heidi also is picked from the mountains, and they both wilt. So don't underestimate the power of what is home to you. It shouldn't come as a surprise to me that Heidi is so filled with these God moments, so filled with scripture references that I recognize. Johanna Spyri, who wrote the book in the late 1880s, she's known as the Swiss Louisa May Alcott. Her grandfather was a pastor. She would have known the passage from Romans that all things work together for those who love God. She would have known the messages of trusting God no matter what, trusting God in the dark days. She would have known that when life gives you these situations that you feel are hopeless, that there is hope. There's hope with God. For example, there's one part of the book where Heidi talks to Peter's grandmother, and she's blind, and she has not had the joy of eating bread in years because the bread that they ate is very rustic, very coarse. But Heidi realizes when she's in Frankfurt, she comes across these beautiful, fluffy, white, soft rolls. and she thinks these are the perfect ones for grandma. And so she brings him back to grandmother in the Alps, and the grandmother is so happy that finally she gets to eat bread. She hasn't enjoyed eating bread in years. And just an example how a situation that Heidi is placed in really turns out to be a blessing for somebody else, that God can use every situation and turn it into something good. At the end of the book, Heidi basically says that to her grandfather, that she just has to trust God. I'm going to paraphrase here, but basically Heidi says to her grandfather that had God answered her prayers when she was pleading and crying with God to do so, had God answered her prayers at that time, so many other prayers would not have been answered. All the prayers that she had that God wasn't answering in that moment, she now sees that God was answering. And so she basically shares that with grandfather, her insights as to how beautiful life has been unfolding. She says to her grandfather, we must always continue to give God our thanks. As Swiss National Day gets into full swing here, I came across what is known as one of the most beloved folk songs of the Swiss. And it's a song that was sung when they had to take the cows to be milked. So it was the song of the cows. It really brings back to a lot of Swiss, a lot of people who love the mountains. It brings back a nostalgia. It brings back memories, and it can bring back a few tears when they think about their place that they called home. In fact, the song was eventually banned because the Swiss mercenaries, the soldiers who were off fighting and away from their home, away from the mountains, whenever they sung this song, it would make them so depressed that they would just get despondent, even suicidal. So eventually the armies banned this song, the cow song, from being sung because they didn't need depressed soldiers on their hands. But the song has experienced a resurgence in popularity again, as I feel more and more people are turning to the past to understand their present, turning to the memories of the past, not to live in the past, not to get stuck in the past, but to gain a deeper understanding of where they come from and what is the good that came from the past that we can bring into the future. And so this cow song it does tug at the heart, and I could see why homesick Swiss mercenaries would get depressed and despondent hearing the song, because that yearning for home can be so great. If you can't return to home, if you can't go back home for whatever reason, or maybe that home doesn't exist anymore, if you can't physically get there, know this: home is still there. It's right here in your heart. And so whenever you're yearning for that place of home, you don't have to physically be there, but just close your eyes and remember. Remember the faces. Remember the places. Remember the stories. Remember the songs. Remember the good times, and shed a tear for the bad times. Just close your eyes and remember home, because it's always in your heart.
Ieto